I recently had a customer ask if it was possible to automate an approval process using Salesforce.com and the Force.com platform. I think that almost all Salesforce users are familiar with the concept of an approval process. I can simply come in to set up, define a new approval process, define the entry criteria for the approval process, and then define a set of actions to take either in terms of approval or in terms of rejection. So it does allow me to map a pretty complex workflow and set of business rules based off of certain conditions. And then here in this example, for this demo, I've created a really simple approval process. It's going to simply look at a site entry object that I've created, and if the status of that is visit pending approval, I want to be able to submit that record for approval. So my entry criteria is to look at that field status on that custom object, and if the value of the status, the pick list, is visit pending approval, then we're going to lock the record and assign it to someone. In this simple example, I'm just going to assign it to myself, but I could also assign it to a queue, a group of users, nested users for nested approvals, etc. And if I approve it, I'm going to just simply change the field from visit pending approval to visit logged. Pretty straightforward. So if I was to do this the normal way inside of Salesforce, what I would do is I would take my custom tab that I've created for that object, and I would add the approve or submit for approval, not on that one. Let me look at a different one. This one should work. There we go. I would simply add the submit for approval button to the list of buttons, and then once I've filled in the details of this record, I would simply submit it. So that's the more traditional way of doing it. But keep in mind, we want to automate this, right? So we want to have this record automatically submitted as a part of the approval based off of one of these field values, as opposed to the user having to remember to manually click the button as a part of the process. So how could we do that? There's a couple ways that we can do that using the Force.com API in just a small amount of Apex. I'm going to show you two examples here. One is submitting and automating an approval process in code behind a trigger, and the other one is making a outbound call to a web service, which basically calls out an Apex class exposed as a web service and submits the automated approval that way. So what I've done is I've created two Apex classes to take advantage of this, or rather not to take advantage of it, but to implement this. The first class I've called Automate Approval Request, and you'll see that it's very simple. I just have one static method here called Submit Approval, and what I'm doing here is I'm creating an instance of a process submit request. We're going to then use that variable to do two interesting things. We are going to set the comments of the approval request, pretty straightforward. And then what's probably the most important one here is we're going to set the object ID, and the ID that we're going to set is the ID of the record that, or of the object that we want to submit to the approval engine. We'll test the entry criteria off of that object, and of course if it matches, it'll walk through the approval process, otherwise it'll be ignored. So the way that we kick that off is by actually using the static process method of our approval object and passing in as an argument that process submit request object. It's going to return a process result. I'm not doing anything with this here, but one thing I could probably do, which would be a little bit more realistic, is do like a syst assert on this to make sure that the return value is true, or excuse me, success. I'm not going to do that here, but when you write this code yourself, especially for a production environment, you probably want to make a little bit more resiliency baked into it like that. So that's going to handle the trigger call from within Salesforce. The other option, or the other approach that I'm taking, is I've simply taken this class and I've turned it into a web service, which I've called Automate Approval Request WS. again, pretty straightforward. So all I've had to do is decorate this a little bit. First thing I did was just make the class global. It's a requirement if you want to create or expose a method of an Apex class through web service. And then the second one is I've taken my submit approval method, and again, I've just annotated it with the web service modifier, so that when we compile this, we know that it's going to be exposed via WSDL and callable through a web service. So pretty straightforward for the most part. This is also very well documented in the, what I mean by that is the use of this API, specifically the approval classes, are really well documented in the Apex reference guide. So if you're having trouble following along on the tutorial, you can certainly refer to that for more detail. So really the only thing left to do is to create a new trigger. So let's do that. The first thing we're going to do, of course, is create an Apex trigger. This is going to call the regular Apex class. We'll call this approve process. Helps if I spell this right. We'll set the object here, and we'll say after update and after insert. Very simple. First thing we'll need is a reference variable to work with. So we'll just say, we'll pull that from the trigger that's coming in. Although triggers all work in bulk, I know that this one's only going to have one record in it, so I'm taking a little bit of a shortcut here for the demo. I would recommend if you do this in the real world, certainly make sure that none of bulk operations will catch you up. We're doing a hard assignment like that. And what we're going to do now is look at the status field of site. Interesting. There we go. And we're going to simply call the trigger here. I'm sorry, call the, not the trigger, the Apex method. And since I made it a static method, it's going to be really easy to call. Save this. I'm going to compile it. We'll build out the workspace here, and then we'll go back into Salesforce and we will test it. So let's do that. I'm going to come back in my custom site tab. Let's create a new one. To make sure I do the zip right, because I have a validation on the zip code field. It does a zip for 4 or 5 plus 4. Make sure that my entry criteria values are set properly. So visit pending approval, that's fine. And we'll save this. Now, what we should see is when we save the record, if this is working, the record will automatically lock, and I'll be able to check the approval, my queue, items to approve, to see that it's actually in there. So there we go. So the record did in fact lock, which is a good thing. Let me go back and check my items to approve. And here's the one that I just created. Very nice. I'll go in here and approve it. Here we can see where I just typed in, and let's just say approved. And there we go. So now we've seen how we can automate the kicking out an approval process with the trigger. Of course, if I did the same thing, went and updated a record, changed the value and saved it, the exact same thing would happen. You remember that my trigger fired on both an after insert and an after update. So let's take a look now at the second part, calling this web service. So this one's kind of interesting. This gives me the ability to make a call from a workflow. So it's kind of a hack, actually, in a way, but an interesting one, I think, nonetheless. So let me just create a new, actually let me do this. Let me show you the one that I've already created just to save a little bit of time here. So I've created a workflow rule. Basically has the same criteria, right? When the status equals visits approval, what it's going to do is it's going to take advantage of one of the actions that you can do with a workflow, and that's an outbound message. So you can't really actually call Apex code, an Apex class as a part of a workflow. Personally, I think it'd be kind of interesting if you could. I could see some real utility and use cases for that. So this is why I say it's a bit of a hack. We are technically calling an Apex class, but we're calling it through a web service, since that's really the option that we have here for calling code. So what I've done, just to show you, we've called approval service, right? All I have to do is provide the endpoint URL and the value that I'm passing in, which is the ID. So where did the endpoint URL come from? This is an interesting point. Let me just show you that really quickly. What I did to make sure that I'm calling the right web service is I've gone back over here to my Apex classes, and I found that web service class here. I've simply selected the WSDL. This is one thing that Safari does really weird. Let me view the source. And now we're looking at the source of my WSDL. What I'm going to do is scroll down to my web service port type binding. And in that port type binding, right, we're going to have a SOAP address. So it's actually the SOAP address, the location of the web service, that I'm going to copy and paste into that endpoint URL field. And then, of course, I'll select my ID field since that's the argument that gets passed in. So at this point now, I have the ability to do two things. I can automate an approval process either by calling a trigger method, or rather by firing a method on a trigger that calls custom Apex classes, or I could create a workflow and make a call out to a web service. Arguably, I would think the first approach, using the trigger-based approach, is certainly the best approach. But if you do want the workflow rule option, certainly you have that at your disposal as well. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of not only how you can automate a workflow process, but really some of the more esoteric things that you can do with the Apex, as well as the Force.com API. So more to come. Stay tuned.